Hey everybody, it's Allie with ANC Photography. I am back. I took 2 weeks off for my birthday and Valentine's Day, and after many requests, we are going to discuss from basically how to go from auto to manual, how to learn your camera settings in a way that you can understand, because I know there's some videos I tried to find on like Facebook, YouTube, all of that just the way they explained it made no sense. So I'm going to try and explain it as best I can. I have my cheat sheet down in front of me right now. I will try to explain this as best I can to you guys. We're going to start off with your aperture. That is covering basically how blurry you want your background, the amount of bokeh you want behind your subject. The lower the number, say it's 1.2, you're going to have a really blurry background. Everything's going to be smooth and creamy. You want it between 1.2 and 4 is usually where I sit when I'm doing my portraits. And you can go, usually when it's like landscape and stuff, you want to bump it up to maybe like 7.1, stuff like that. So the more bokeh and blur you want, the lower your number needs to be. The more detail you want in your backdrop or background, the higher your number needs to be. And that's also, depending on the range you can get with that, is going to depend on your lens. I know the lens that I'm fixing to order has an lowest is f2.8. That's a really good range. That's a good amount of bokeh. That's like a sweet spot for me. I like that behind that amount of bokeh behind my clients, especially for my portraits and such. So keeping my subject in focus while blurring out the background really well is a huge thing that I love when it comes to the look of my photos. Now, when it comes to ISO, this is something that I was super confused about for a while, and there's sometimes I brain fart and I forget what it needs to be on in some situations, so I have to sit there, take a test shot, adjust it, take a test shot, adjust it until I get it exactly where I need it. I shoot a lot of outside, so I'm usually, because it's Florida, our weather goes from sunny to thunderstorm in seconds sometimes. So if you're shooting and you want to shoot outside where it's super bright, you want to keep your numbers low. So your ISO needs to be around anywhere between 100 to 250, depending on cloud coverage, depending on if you're taking photos under like a pavilion at the beach or an umbrella. You want to have it lower because that's going to let in the least amount of light. So lower, least amount of light. So when you're out in a bright scenario, keep your numbers low. If you're wanting to photograph at night or in a really dark room, like you're out, at a dance or something, and you're trying to photograph, everybody, or it's a wedding, would be probably more, understandable here, because a lot of you guys shoot weddings. If it's really dark, they have it really moody in there, you're basically going off of like a disco ball light type situation, and you don't want to constantly have flash going off all the time, you're going to want to know how to adjust your ISO to get the amount of light in that you're going to need to make that photo look properly exposed. You're going to want to keep that higher. If you're in a darker room, you want the higher number to let in more light. Lower number, when it's brighter outside, to let in less light. So that way you're not overexposing, you're not underexposing, everything can kind of mesh where it needs to be at. Now when it comes to your exposure, your meter on there that's got, you start with 0 and it's got the little ticks, it's the little line. You want to keep that as close to 0 as possible, maybe hopefully at 0, if not right before or right after. That's just kind of the sweet spot for where you want to have your exposure set to on the meter. Basically, those are the main settings. I'm not the best at explaining shutter speed, I'll tell you that right now. But that's really important for if you're wanting to shoot sports or kids in general. My shutter speed really varies on the age of child that I am photographing and the amount of running around they would like to do. When I photograph newborns, they are not really moving, so I don't need my shutter speed to be, insane. But if I'm like photographing my kids riding their bikes, or I'm photographing a toddler that's like running around wanting to touch everything, all the props, do all the things, which is fine, that's good for some candid shots. you want to make sure that you have your shutter speed adjusted accordingly. So I'll kind of describe it as to how it's going to show up on your camera. There's a 1 and then a slash and then your numbers that you're going to want. Those are the numbers that are going to shift, or the numbers that be on the other side of that little slash. So if you want to, say, freeze sprinkler water droplets, or just in general, like you're out and your kids are splashing in a puddle and you want to be able to get those droplets in the air as they're going back down and the water's coming up, you want to keep that at, we have the 1 slash for about 4,000 or up. When it comes to outdoor sports and stuff like that, like your kids are playing soccer, you want to photograph that, keep it around 2,000, 1/2000th. Anything that is lower than that, honestly, I'd say honestly lower than 1/60th. I like to keep on a tripod anything lower than that, because your shutter is closing so fast to try and capture that, you're going to get a blurry image. So if you're out like taking, I tried to do it one year without a tripod and it was awful. Trying to photograph like fireworks. I bring my tripod if I do want to get some of those shots, and I keep it really, really low, like 1/8, anywhere between 1/60th and 1/8, just kind of depending on the lighting situation as well, is kind of where I want to keep it. But anywhere in that lower number range, you're going to want to have it on a tripod, because it's just going to blur. Because your hand, it will catch any small shaky move. You want to keep it on a tripod. So yeah, that covers your aperture, your ISO, your exposure meter, and your shutter speed. I wish I could explain shutter speed better. I'm just not that great at it. That's something I'm still learning, which you'd figure I'd have it down by now, considering I usually photograph kids running around. But I hope that this was kind of a decent example of, you know, what your camera settings need to be during certain situations. This was just kind of a quick tip video on, you know, just an explanation of, if you're shooting on manual, you need to pay attention to your environment and have your settings to this, this, and this. But just play around with it. Take your camera out, photograph your kids. If you don't have kids, photograph your pet. You don't have a pet, just get outside, photograph nature. You know, birds, squirrels, all that stuff, or products, you know, product photography. That was something I was really trying to hone before. I'm not the best at product photography. I'm still learning with that. It's actually a lot harder than it looks. But having to learn about my aperture settings was a big thing with that, because I was getting just really weirdly bokeh, not bokeh background, and it was just a mess. It was a lot. So photographing that kind of thing is a good way to kind of learn, because you're right there. It's a controlled environment. You can adjust your settings with your lights. You can play around with what level of bokeh you want in your photos. So just get out there, practice. That was the fastest way that I learned how to adjust my camera settings, was just taking my kids to the park, letting them run around. And because the light was constantly changing, because it was pretty cloudy outside, so the sun was covered up and then it wasn't, and then it was, and then it wasn't, I was able to kind of put everything into action and be like, oh, okay, that's too exposed. I need to adjust my numbers accordingly, so that way, you know, it's not so bright and in your face. But because I was having to constantly finagle and change my settings because the weather was so shifty and the lighting was just very much off and on, off and on, I was able to learn, and it got stuck in my head, okay, lower number for brighter situations, higher number for darker situations. And that's something that now at my sessions, if we start to have cloud coverage, I don't have to sit there and take 50 different test shots. I get maybe 1 or 2 just to make sure I have it in my sweet spot where I like it, what's best for my editing style. But I don't have to sit there and constantly wonder or look up, hey, how dark do I need, how high do I need these numbers, how low do I need these numbers? I'm able to know from memory, okay, if it's super bright outside, I need to lower that number. Oh, it's getting dark, it's getting cloudy, all right, let me up my number. So that way I knew that my ISO was where it needed to be during whatever type of weather we were having that day. Or if I'm going from shooting inside to shooting outside, I was able to really move and know how I needed to have my camera settings adjusted to make it to where I got the best exposure possible, which makes everything in post-processing so much easier when you have already paid attention to your exposure in camera. Because if you're not paying attention to your exposure in camera, editing is going to be a beast. And a lot of times when you shoot on auto, your exposure is all over the place. Your camera is not as good as your eye as a photographer. You're not going to get as good a quality and as good of an exposure and bokeh and everything else as you would on manual while shooting with auto. It's not going to have the insight and the knowledge that you do to be able to catch on to the certain way that you want your image to look. So if you guys have any other questions, or you guys would like me to do a little more of an in-depth and maybe like take you guys with me on a session so you guys can see how I would adjust my settings, and I can kind of show behind the scenes of how I do my camera settings and adjust things during a session in the moment, I can do that if you guys would like for me to, to do that for you guys. But yeah, if you guys have any other questions that I didn't answer, or I did answer but not well enough, feel free to comment below. Make sure you like, subscribe, and I think I'm gonna start posting on Wednesdays instead of Tuesdays, because Wednesdays are a little less chaotic than Tuesdays. So we will be posting every Wednesday instead of every Tuesday, but I will see you guys next week. I hope you guys have an amazing day.